Good evening. Please be seated. Before I begin my introduction, I just want to remind you that there will be a question period, as usual, after the lecture, down the hall to the right in the junior common room. Our speaker this evening, Professor James Conant, is the Chester D. Tripp Professor of the Humanities at the University of Chicago. He has written extensively on Wittgenstein's philosophy and is widely respected as a commentator on his works. He, along with Cora Diamond, pioneered a reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus that has permanently changed scholarly discussion of that book. It is a reading that takes seriously Wittgenstein's own stated ethical intentions in writing it and his ultimate rejection of its propositions as nonsense. Professor Conant is sensitive to the literary aspects of Wittgenstein's writing and sees the interrelationship between those aspects and its larger philosophical aims. Also, he has highlighted the parallels between Wittgenstein's works and those outside of analytic philosophy, those of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in particular. Finally, Professor Conant, in his writing, emphasizes the continuity of Wittgenstein's thinking over his life. Thus, Professor Conant's work could be said to complicate the conventional academic distinctions between genres, between traditions in philosophy, and between Wittgenstein's philosophy early and late. I'm very pleased to have Jim here. I've learned a great deal from his work and have benefited from his generous encouragement over the years. I can think of no better person to help us think more deeply about Wittgenstein's philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Conant.
Thank you, Caleb. Can you hear me all right in the back? Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here for the first time in St. John's College in Santa Fe. I, to some extent, put together this lecture with this audience in mind, or at least my imagination of this audience, based on rumor, hearsay, and maybe some hard evidence. And my thought was that many of you would be more familiar with ancient philosophy, and perhaps especially Socrates and Plato, than with Wittgenstein. So this is a lecture which I'm imagining for many of you might be an introduction to Wittgenstein. And I thought I'd introduce you to Wittgenstein by way of some reflections on his relations to Socrates. But on the other hand, I think there's a reason to do that even if you're not talking to people at St. John's. Namely that I think certain things that are quite remarkable or distinctive about Wittgenstein, at least distinctive compared with most of the other major philosophers of the last century. Why I qualify things in that way will become clear. But I think certain things that are remarkable about him as a figure of recent history of philosophy can especially be brought into focus by thinking about him in connection with Socrates. So this lecture is titled, as you may have noticed on your way in, Some Socratic Aspects of Wittgenstein. And why it's titled that and what I mean by a conception of philosophy having a Socratic aspect or aspects, I'm hoping will become clear as I go along. So let that be a bit of a riddle for the moment, which will be answered over the course of the lecture. Maybe I'll just say one word about the structure of the lecture and then jump in. My thought is it will consist of 3 parts. The first and longest part will basically be a preliminary examination, testing your knowledge of at least Socrates, and perhaps Wittgenstein too, if you have some, or at least inducing some knowledge in that area if you don't. The second, next bit of the lecture, will be a reflection on why a claim to the effect that a particular philosopher's philosophy, or his way of doing philosophy, bears a Socratic aspect would have once been a very uninteresting thing to say about a philosopher. And why, finally, in the last part of the lecture, I think it's quite an interesting thing to say about Wittgenstein. Okay, so we come to the first part of the lecture. And it is, so get ready. Do you all have a handout? If you don't have a handout, could you sit next to someone who has a handout? You're going to need a handout. Or it will really help you. Maybe people can share, if possible. I'll try to read things out, but I was hoping people could see these. I asked them to make as many as would be required, but perhaps that was an overly vague instruction. Okay, so the first part of this lecture is going to consist of an examination. You're about to take an exam. I have a feeling these may be frowned upon at St. John's, I'm not sure. But we have an intruder from the outside world, and he's now going to make you take an exam. Right now, all of you. But first I'll give you an idea of how the exam's going to work and why we're doing it. It's going to consist mostly of quotations. And in fact, this first part of the lecture, the exam, is itself subdivided into 3 parts. We're going to begin with a warm-up exam, just to kind of get you into the spirit of the exercise, loosen you up, make you realize, oh my God, I really have to do this. And then there'll be what I will call the exam proper. And that will consist of 7 main questions. Those are each italicized on your handout or at your exam. And the italicized questions are incredibly easy. This is, my way of sifting out the people that really aren't paying attention. So we have these really easy italicized questions. And each of them is followed by some subsidiary questions that are considerably more difficult, I think, even for an expert in these matters. And then finally comes the last part of the exam, which we'll just call the extra credit portion of the exam. I'll say more about that later. So, as I said a moment ago, it will consist mostly of quotations. And the quotations, in turn, are mostly of 2 sorts. Some are passages or remarks that are spoken or written by Socrates himself or Wittgenstein himself. And the idea is to figure out which. And the second sort of quotations or remarks are ones that are made by someone about Socrates or Wittgenstein. The question there is he talking about or is she talking about? It's usually he, Socrates or Wittgenstein. Now, my thought in giving you this exam is the following. If it proves difficult to say whether a given remark is by Socrates or Wittgenstein, or in the other case, about Socrates or Wittgenstein, that itself should reveal something about the depth of the parallels here. If you, Socrates experts, feel like most of these passages are about or could be spoken by, in the cases where it's by the philosopher Socrates, that shows you something, even if you haven't read Wittgenstein. In the preliminary, and the warm-up part of the exam, we'll just do a bunch of these. When we get to the exam proper, I will also start to transition into a lecture mode, because I can't help myself. And at that point, we'll begin to explore the parallels in a little more detail, alternating with the questions. And so there'll be some reflection, not only on the fact of these parallels, but how deep they reach and what they might show. All right, so you ready for the warm-up part of the test? So it's right there in your handouts, the first thing that comes. The first quotation as part of the test is, in fact, as it happens, about tests. So our philosopher speaks, and he says this, quote, "Everyone has a simple test to tell whether a cobbler makes good shoes. There is no test of this sort to discover whether a philosopher does his job or not." Is that Socrates or Wittgenstein speaking? Next one. I give you permission to define each word the way you like. You can do that just so long as you make clear the application of whatever word you use. Shall we take a little poll? How many people think the first one is Socrates? How many people think it's Wittgenstein? Okay, second one. How many people think it's Socrates? How many people think it's Wittgenstein? You guys are good. The majority got that right. But I think the people who got it wrong could be forgiven, don't you? I tried to choose them, so I might have gone the other way anyways. Third quotation. Call me a truth seeker, and I will be satisfied. Socrates or Wittgenstein? I'm going to not give you the answer to that one until almost the end of the lecture, so you have something to stay awake for. Okay, here are 2 more questions. In the first of 2 more quotations, or 2 more passages, 2 more things to puzzle over, the next 2. In the first, our philosopher notes halfway through one of his dialectical excursions that at the point that's been reached, Quote, we have helped our interlocutor now to some extent towards finding the right answer. For now, not only is he aware that he is ignorant of it, but now he'll be quite eager to look for the answer. Second quotation, our philosopher remarks, anything your interlocutor can do for himself, leave to him. Which is Wittgenstein? Which is Socrates? I'll just give you the answer. First is Socrates, second is Wittgenstein. Here are a few more warm-up questions. You'll start speeding up a bit. So, now we're going to hear from four commentators, scholars, or comrades, speaking in each case about one of these two philosophers. Here's the first of these. Quote, he shows his interlocutors a projection of their own selves. He splits himself in two. So there are two of him, the one who knows in advance how the discussion's going to end, and the one who travels the entire dialectical path along with his interlocutor. Is that about Socrates or Wittgenstein? By the way, if you can't stand waiting, all the answers are in the back, but I tried to make them a little bit hard to look up so that you wouldn't be cheating too much and you're actually working a bit. Next one. He was constantly fighting with the deepest philosophical problems. The solution of one problem led to another problem. And he was uncompromising. So he had to have complete understanding. Is that of Socrates or Wittgenstein? One more. It's a telling fact that everyone got carried away whenever they talked about him, whether it was someone singing his praises or his enemies ranting against him. Said of Socrates or Wittgenstein. And, quote, he had an extraordinary gift for divining the thoughts of the person with whom he was in discussion. While the other struggled to put his thought into words, he, our philosopher, would perceive what it was and state it for him, for the interlocutor. This power of his sometimes seemed uncanny. Said of Socrates or Wittgenstein. Here are the answers to the last four. Socrates, Wittgenstein, Socrates, Wittgenstein. Here are four more instances of commentators, scholars, friends, speaking in each case about one of the two. Quote, one of his beliefs was that philosophy cannot be accurately captured in a lecture or a treatise. Said of Socrates or Wittgenstein. Quote, when he invented an example in order to illustrate a point, he would grin at the absurdity of what he had just imagined. But if any member of the audience were to chuckle along with him, his expression would change to severity, and he would exclaim in reproof, no, I'm serious. Socrates or Wittgenstein. Quote, most of the paradoxical views that can be attributed to him are actually based on things he said to someone, or which he agreed to for a distinctive purpose, in a distinctive context. Said about Socrates or Wittgenstein. Quote, he was not an easy guru to follow, not least because a guru was the one thing he resolutely refused to be. Still, it's hardly surprising that after his death, several of his friends wanted to carry on the good work somehow. Since it was and is no simple matter to say exactly what the good work amounts to, it should be equally unsurprising that these would-be successors of his ended up each championing very different causes. Is that said about Socrates and his would-be successors, or Wittgenstein and his would-be followers? Here again are the answers to the last four questions. Socrates, Wittgenstein, Socrates, Socrates. But even if you didn't get the source of the exact quotation right for any of those eight, I think each of them says a true thing about both, which is why the exam is hard to take if you don't recognize the source. You always have a 50% chance of being lucky and getting it right, remember. Well, that concludes your practice exam. I hope you're warmed up. I hope that handful of examples prepares you for the real thing. Now we turn to what I was calling the exam proper. From now on, though I want you to take the exam, please keep track of your own score. This is an honors test. So I'm now going to ask you some further questions in much the same vein. Be ready for them. And after each such question, before I tell you your answer, I really want you to make a guess. You can do it out loud to yourself. You let your neighbor hear you. If you want someone else to keep track along with you, or you can do it quietly to yourself. That's up to you. Now, this next part, the exam proper, falls into 7 numbered propositions, like the Tractatus. It consists of 7 italicized main questions, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And those 7 italicized questions are incredibly easy to get right. Because, and I'll tell you this right now, they each admit of 2 correct answers. So, if you can't figure out what the 2 correct answers are, you fail the exam, and I'm very disappointed in you. But the harder ones are the 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and so forth, the subsidiary ones. Those, again, are actual quotations made by or about one of our philosophers. There's only one right answer. But again, the point is to bring out how easily it might have been about the other, even if the actual source was either from the 20th century or the 5th century BC, depending upon who they were talking about. So, remember, here's the one. It has 2 correct answers. It's italicized to bring out its difference. 1, which great philosopher lived an ascetic existence, spurning wealth and fame, but did not hold up that way of life, his own way of life, as a model to his friends and students, encouraging them often instead to take up ordinary professional trades, to immerse themselves in the world from which the philosopher himself, taking up with only or mostly philosophy, had withdrawn. That one had 2 correct answers. The next ones are related to that topic, but they're said by a particular person or by our person. So, here's the first of them, 1A. Looking back upon his life, one of our 2 philosophers finds himself claiming the following about himself. Quote, I did not care for the things that most people care about, making money, having a comfortable home, high military or civil rank. Looking back upon the life of one of our philosophers, a comrade of his remarks the following, quote, a great simplicity, at times even an extreme frugality, became characteristic of his life, which is said of by our philosopher, Socrates or Wittgenstein, which is said about our philosopher, Socrates or Wittgenstein. Well, the first is Socrates in the Apology. I hope many of you recognize that one, speaking to the court. The second is a famous Finnish philosopher, Herr von Richt, speaking of Wittgenstein. The point of our opening numbered question, this is when I start to lapse into lecture mode finally, the point of our opening numbered question is that in neither case did our philosopher take his frugality, his own frugality, that in accordance with which he lived, to be binding upon those who wished to learn philosophy from him and whom he sought to teach philosophy. Socrates in no way considered money, making it, or having a comfortable home, achieving distinguished military or civil rank, or for that matter, many another aspect of a conventionally successful, reputable Athenian life, to be the sort of thing which was bad in itself. It wasn't what you did in that sense, but how you did it. His asceticism did not, in that sense, reflect a central precept of his philosophy, as it did for many a subsequent Greek philosopher who modeled himself on Socrates. Socrates himself never preached abstinence, for example, and indeed he was famous for being able to drink others under the table, if it befitted the occasion. He often encouraged his interlocutor to excel in the trade which he had already chosen as his vocation, as his way of life, and wanted only to help clarify for that interlocutor what it would mean for him really to thus excel. The philosophical life for Socrates, therefore, did not compete in a straightforward way with some other sort of life. Rather, he viewed it as forming a dimension of any well-lived life. And I think Wittgenstein would have certainly agreed with that last thought. But his own relation to the philosophical life, I think it can also be said, remained far more torture than it ever was for Socrates. Maybe this is part of living in the 20th century. Unlike Socrates, Wittgenstein did not regard himself as simply constitutionally so inclined, as inevitably to become fully occupied with the life of the mind, and thus free of any inclination to bother with such things as clothing, food, money, and especially fame or reputation. Rather, he viewed such external goods as positive temptations, distractions from the life he thought would really make him happy, that he really wanted to lead, that was really worth living. He would accordingly withdraw, sometimes for months at a time, to remote locations in Norway or Ireland, to assure that he could not be distracted from the philosophical problems and issues and thoughts with which he wished to struggle. He gave away his inherited family fortune with a ferocity and velocity which suggests he feared that what it might do to him if it remained in his possession. And this was his father was by far the richest man in Austria. He was the John D. Rockefeller of pre-World War I Austria. One has the sense that he, Wittgenstein, forced the rigors of a simple life upon himself, rather than he just naturally was attracted to or fell into such a way of life. Nonetheless, he's famous for always wearing the same clothes, especially the same gray tweed jacket, and he once formulated his personal philosophy of food in the following way. It does not matter what you eat, as long as you always eat the same thing. Yet, as in the case of Socrates, none of these merely outward features of his own way of life was ever adduced by Wittgenstein as prescriptions for what he thought was also to be generally regarded by friends or pupils as a well-lived life, is what he needed to do to live such a life. Quite the contrary, and now with an edge of urgency about what philosophy might do to someone that one never encounters quite in Socrates. Wittgenstein tended to encourage his pupils to abandon their full-time study of philosophy and to consider rather becoming doctors, carpenters, or practitioners of some other honorable conventional trade. He was genuinely concerned about what the effect on his students' souls might be of their entering into what we now call philosophy as a full-time profession. But even this particular dimension of contrast between the two philosophers, between Wittgenstein and Socrates, is a bit misleading, I think. In Socrates' time, philosopher was not yet the putative title of an established trade. Socrates never needed to worry about what might become of the souls of his students if they were to spend their entire lives inhaling nothing but academic air. Being a philosopher was not yet an imaginable way of being what the modern Japanese now call a salary man. The closest thing in ancient Athens to a career option, which sort of resembled that of what Socrates called the philosopher, but also allowed of sufficient remuneration that you could live from it, was to go into business for oneself as a sophist. Then you could charge money for your services. But then you were also, at most, something which, for Socrates, was nothing more than a simulacrum of a philosopher. Okay, second question on your exam, italicized, easy question, midst of two answers. Which great philosopher was especially renowned for the intensity of his intellectual concentration, liable to fall into a state of complete absorption in a philosophical problem, a state in which he became utterly oblivious to the world around him? Two answers to that one. One answer to this. Quote, said about our philosopher, when he was trying to draw a thought out of himself, he would prohibit with a peremptory motion of the hand any questions or remarks. There were frequent and prolonged periods of silence, with only an occasional mutter from him and the stillest attention from the others. He was extremely tense and active. His gaze was concentrated, his face alive. His hands made arresting movements. His expression was stern. One knew that one was in the presence of extreme seriousness, absorption, and force of intellect. Socrates, Wittgenstein. Quote, he started wrestling with some problem or other about sunrise one morning and just stood there lost in thought. And when the answer wouldn't come, he still stood there thinking and refused to give up. In this case, rather than just giving you the answers, I think what I'll do is I'll continue reading from each of these reports, and it will become clear from the context who's being talking about. So continuing the second passage, it goes along like this, quote, "Time went by, and by about midday the troops began telling each other how he had been standing there thinking, for that's all he seemed to be doing, ever since daybreak. And at last, towards nightfall, some of the Ionians brought out their bedding after supper, partly to see whether he's going to stay there all night. Well, he stood there till morning, and then at sunrise he said his prayers to the sun and went away." And the first of the two passages continues like this. "Wittgenstein's personality dominated these meetings. I doubt anyone in the room failed to be influenced by him in some way. Indeed, very few of us could keep from acquiring imitations, gestures, intonations, exclamations from him. These imitations could easily appear ridiculous when compared with their original." That's Norman Malcolm speaking, perhaps Wittgenstein's most famous American student. And in case you think he's exaggerating, I'll tell you another little story. When Wittgenstein visited the United States, the only time he did, a year before his death, he went to visit Malcolm in Ithaca, New York, in Cornell, 1915. And when this happened, Malcolm invited all of his students over to his house to finally meet the great philosopher whose work he's been teaching. However, one of Malcolm's students had been out of town and arrived only that evening and received a note telling that he should go to Professor Malcolm's house immediately. And so he rushes over there. Mrs. Malcolm lets him in. And as he's taking off his galoshes by the entryway, he looks into the living room and notices what's going on there, and in particular there's one figure. And he asks Mrs. Malcolm, quote, "Who's that man with the German accent in the next room imitating Professor Malcolm?" Third question, italicized. Which great philosopher's mode of discussion with others was no less intense than his aforementioned capacity for isolated absorption in thought? That's the easy question. Now, question with only one answer. Quote, "Each conversation with him was like living through the day of judgment. It was terrible. Everything had constantly to be dug up anew, questioned, and subjected to tests of truthfulness, concerning not only philosophy, but the whole of life." Second quotation. "Anyone who is close to him and enters into conversation with him is liable to be drawn into argument, and whatever subject he may start, he will be continually carried round and round by him, until at last that person finds that he has to give an account both of his present and his past life. And when the interlocutor is once entangled, our philosopher will not let go of him until he has completely and thoroughly sifted him." The first remark is again that Finnish philosopher talking about Wittgenstein. The second is about Socrates. 4. Which great philosopher received a military decoration for bravery in battle? That's the easy question. Now two harder ones. Quote, "You are mistaken." These are by our philosopher, each of them. I'll give you 4, each by our philosopher. "You are mistaken if you think that a man who is worth anything ought to spend his time weighing up the prospects of his life and death." Quote, "Now I have an opportunity to be a decent human being because I am face to face with death." Quote, "I may die in an hour. I may die in 2 hours. I may die in a month, or not for a few years. I cannot know about it, and I cannot do anything for or against it. Such is this life. How then ought I to live in order to hold my own at the moment, to live amid the good and the beautiful until life stops of itself?" And finally, fourth in this sequence, quote, "Those who pursue philosophy rightly study to die." The first is from the Apology. The middle two are written by Wittgenstein on the Austrian front. while facing death there. The fourth is from the Phaedo. I think all four of these quotations make the following clear. The relevant parallel between our thinkers would be underestimated. That is, you'd miss the point of the fourth italicized quotation. If you take the point just to be that they each happen to fall under these two descriptions: great philosopher, decorated soldier. Rather, each viewed his conduct on the battlefield as a forging and testing ground of his philosophy. Each of them viewed learning how to die, and how to die well, as part of what it means to live well. Fifth question, easy one. Just easy question. Which great philosopher's decoration in battle was regarded by those who knew him as just one conspicuous outward sign of a much broader capacity for self-mastery? And now, the two harder ones. One about Socrates, one about Wittgenstein. Which is which? Quote, or I take that back. One about Socrates or Wittgenstein, another about Socrates or Wittgenstein. No hints, no clues. Quote, he was by all accounts supremely disciplined and a master of rational self-control. Maybe that was the problem. Perhaps it explains why he had such impossibly high expectations for others. It's been said of him that, quote, in the strength of his character lay the weakness of his philosophy, end quote, end quote. Quote, there was practically nothing he was not or could not have been able to do unusually well, if it belonged at all to the sort of thing that can be brought under voluntary control, where training and practice are essential to the learning process. As it happens, the first of these said about Socrates, the second about Wittgenstein. 6, easy question. Which great philosopher often seems to cast a spell on others, either powerfully attracting or repelling, one or the other, attracting or repelling those around him? Okay, I'll give you a little hint. In the next two remarks, in one of them, we hear Alcibiades speaking of Socrates. Which of these two is the voice of Alcibiades? Quote, it seems he cannot avoid casting a spell, and some are repelled by it as strongly as others are attracted. Those that are drawn to him are bound by an affection which has in it something that perhaps can be called love. It happens to fishermen and farmers as well as to philosophers. Quote, I've been bitten in the heart or the mind, or whatever you like to call it, by his philosophy, which clings like an adder to any young and gifted mind it can get a hold of. Alcibiades speaks second, a Norwegian student of Wittgenstein's first. Last easy question, number 7. Which famous philosopher is often credited with the capacity of being able to see a philosophical problem, as if for the first time, as if no one had ever stated it or thought it before? Hard question, 7a. He would talk about almost anything, and always with the same intensity. He impressed me time and time again by lifting familiar problems into the light as if he were the very first to see the problem, unhampered by conventional and received views. Said about Socrates or Wittgenstein? Wittgenstein. Okay, that concludes the exam proper. Please remember your test score. I assume you've been keeping track. Okay. Now, in posing and answering the above questions, I often needed to elaborate the extent of the parallels between them by resorting to memoirs, quoting biographical works, sometimes works that recount specific anecdotes told about each of them. He stayed up all night and the soldiers gathered around. Now that's a very particular mode of displaying what is essential in a philosopher's conception of philosophy. That mode of displaying what a philosophy is arguably essential to, lies at the heart of an ancient understanding of the way in which philosophy is such to be accessed. An understanding that Socrates himself, I think, did much to actually put in place. This way of thinking about what it is to get a philosophy into view in the first place no longer lies near the heart of our contemporary understanding of what philosophy is. And yet Wittgenstein seems an exception to this rule about the nature of contemporary philosophy. He's a figure whose conception of philosophy has seemed to many a commentator precisely to require that an access to it be opened up partly via deployment of these sorts of instruments of biographical depiction or anecdotes or stories. And that itself is a datum of some interest, I think, which I will return to in a moment. But before we do that, now that you've had a little rest, we will conclude this part of the lecture with the extra credit portion of the exam. As is customary in this kind of concluding portion of an exam, if you want extra credit, I should warn you, these questions are trick questions. You have to figure out how they're trick questions. So again, here we have 3 quotations by 3 different commentators. My question is, Socrates or Wittgenstein? Quote, "He sought a philosophy that would find the consent of all, yet despaired of reaching common accord with more than a few friends." Quote, "An encounter with this philosopher can be radically unsettling precisely insofar as it does not merely reveal that reality is not what it appeared to you to be, but that you no longer know how it appeared to you. It's not that your belief turned out to be mistaken, or that nothing in the world answers to your desire. Instead, you lose your grasp, or better, you realize that you never had a grasp on what you desired or believed in the first place, on what should be most intimately your own." Is that said of Socrates or Wittgenstein? Quote, "It's no wonder that no new knowledge needs to be added to the philosophical work. The only thing needed is to work with what one already knows. For the problems are not problems external to ourselves, but rather precisely a part of ourselves." Is that said about Socrates or Wittgenstein? Have you figured out why these are trick questions? In all 3 cases, the answer is both. These 3 passages are from 3 commentators who are trying to characterize what they take to be an important parallel between our 2 philosophers, and are writing about both of them at once. So that brings me to the next part of the lecture, which is about a time when every philosophy had a Socratic aspect. Precisely because he did not write anything. In the case of Socrates, it's impossible to draw our customary sharp, contemporary distinction between the life of the philosopher, on the one hand, the life, and the philosopher's work, on the other. Socrates' life is his work, and his work is his life. He strived to live and to provide an exemplar of what it means to live a certain kind of life, that of someone who loves wisdom, which, as I'm sure you know, is quite literally what those 2 ancient Greek words, philosophia, mean. So there's no understanding of Socrates' philosophy apart from this. That is, apart from understanding of the life he thinks worth living and that he's seeking to live. What the example of Socrates makes immediately evident is something that is equally true, but I think less perspicuously so, in the case of Wittgenstein. In order to understand the philosopher, we need a way of understanding the relation between what we're inclined to call his philosophy and what we're now inclined to call his life. A relation that allows us to see that life is something internally related to that philosophy. The life as an expression of the philosophy and the way of philosophizing as an expression of that conception of how to live. When and how Socrates challenges the charge brought against him in the court of corrupting the youth of Athens. When and how he accepts the verdict of the court against him. When and how he refuses his subsequent opportunity in jail to flee, not only the jail, but Athens. When and how he behaves in his final moment when he voluntarily drinks the hemlock and lies down to die. These are all expressions of Socrates' philosophy, and his modes of reflection on each are part and parcel of his articulation, of his conception of how to live. No understanding of what Socrates thought philosophy was is possible, apart from an appreciation of how philosophy finds expression in a life such as these, in moments such as those, and many others. That is, in a life such as the one that Socrates lived. Aristotle asks, this is on your handout now in the next part, we have a bunch of quotations about ancient philosophy, some by ancient philosophers, some by modern historians of ancient philosophy. The first of these is Aristotle asking, what more accurate standard or measure of good things do we have than the sage? When Aristotle asks that rhetorical question, he's just one, and really one of the first, in a long line of philosophers to bear implicit witness to the way in which the figure of Socrates leaves a remarkable imprint on the whole of ancient philosophy. If one turns to the great schools of Hellenistic philosophy, the skeptics, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Neoplatonists, they all sought to practice something which I think we can call a broadly Socratic conception of philosophy. In this sense, they all sought to encourage the pursuit of a kind of life, with Aristotle we might call it the life of a sage, for which, for all of their differences, and they were very preoccupied with how they differed from one another, they all took Socrates to offer a more or less adequate embodiment of that life, the one that they were then trying to articulate in their very different philosophies. Philosophy, that is, for all of them, was not something you simply learned, say, by reading certain books, or taking certain examinations, or listening to certain lectures, even ones that contain examinations. Rather, it was something you practiced. And Socrates' life was exemplary of this praxis. Yes, of course, there figured in the course of such a praxis, among other things, arguments and attempts to grapple with them, conclusions, and so forth. But those arguments and conclusions were themselves integral parts of a set of spiritual exercises through the employment of which one sought, as philosopher, to transform oneself. So each of these Hellenistic schools, for instance, sought to achieve a certain sort of telos. The skeptics sought the telos of ataraxia, or tranquility, the Neoplatonists that of ecstasis, or ecstatic union with the cosmos, and so on in each case, where the telos in question is neither merely a theoretical achievement, one understands what one should understand about philosophical doctrines, nor a merely practical one. It's a matter of successfully giving a certain sort of shape to oneself, where that's achieved in part by giving a certain sort of shape to one's life, where both in turn are achieved through the attainment of certain forms of understanding. During this period, with respect to a great many controversial philosophical issues, the Epicureans were generally inclined to champion something, and when they did, at that moment, the Stoics were apt to proclaim the opposite. Yet, and the skeptic, of course, would resolutely refuse to affirm either the original proposition or its negation. But despite all those differences, Epicurus, in the next quotation in your handout, speaks for all three of the major schools when he says this: empty are the words of the philosopher offers no therapy for human suffering. For just as there is no use in medical expertise if it does not provide therapy for bodily diseases, so too there is no use in philosophy if it does not expel the suffering of the soul. Call that the generic conception of philosophy that they shared, one in which philosophy treats of sickness in the soul in a way that's at least usefully compared with the manner in which a physician treats of sickness in the body. This was understood by the practitioners of all three of the major Hellenistic schools to be an understanding of philosophy that derived from the teaching of Socrates. And that's the point of the next quotation from a famous historian of philosophy. I won't read it out, but I give you his authority on it. Then you have a quotation from Pierre Hadot, in which Hadot tries to sum up what the word philosophy means in the Hellenistic and Roman eras. I'll just read the very last part of this quotation. Philosophy was a method of spiritual progress which demanded a radical conversion and transformation of the individual's way of being. Thus, philosophy was a way of life, both in its exercise and effort to achieve wisdom and in its goal, wisdom itself. For the real wisdom does not merely cause us to know, it makes us be in a different way. It is itself essentially practical. It's not just that it has practical application. And the sign of one's understanding of it is what one does and how one lives. On this conception of philosophy, a philosopher's life just is the definitive expression of his philosophy. For such a philosopher, his writings, that is, that which we moderns are tempted to call his work, are simply one means to facilitate the achievement of that work on the self, which is properly to be identified with the philosopher's work. Now that has implications for the sorts of role that writing, philosophical writing that aims to depict the life of the philosopher, can assume in ground-level philosophical practice. And it helps to explain why in ancient Greek and Roman texts we find so many anecdotes and little biographical narratives and excerpts pertaining to the lives of philosophers, as well as a whole genre of the lives of the philosophers, some of which instances of which we still have. Anecdotes about philosophers wedded to this or that teaching are reduced by the ancients as an instrument not only for describing, but also for evaluating, positively or negatively criticizing the philosophical teaching in question. I give you two quotations about this from excerpts, one from the famous historian of ancient times, Arnoldo Mamigliano, from his book, The Development of Greek Biography, where he gives you an example of how a certain story about a philosopher was used to discredit him. The next quotation is from my colleague in Chicago, Arnold Davidson, who brings out how anecdotes were used by philosophers at large as weapons against hostile schools. But although these two historians are emphasizing how biography and anecdote serves a negative polemical function, I think it's also important here to emphasize that it also serves an important positive function in ancient times, to provide, as I put it before, a representation of the philosophical life proper. And this tradition of philosophical biography, so conceived, was really initiated by Plato's and Xenophon's respective accounts of the life of Socrates. There's much to say about this, but I am going to skip it and therefore skip the other quotations about ancient biography and simply rush you down to the quotation from Cicero that you have next on your handout. What I'm really trying to bring out here is how subsequent Hellenistic and Roman philosophers consistently look back to Socrates as someone who had introduced what we might call an irreversible kink into the history of thought. Cicero sums up his understanding of the historical situation as follows, writing in Roman times. Quote, "From the ancient days down to the time of Socrates," that is, up to Socrates, philosophy dealt with numbers and movements. He's thinking here especially the pre-Socratics, of course, with the problem whence all things came or whither they return, and zealously inquired into the size of the stars, the spaces that divided them, their courses, and all celestial phenomena. Socrates, on the other hand, was the first to call philosophy down from the heavens and set her in the cities of men and compel her to ask questions about life and morality, things good and evil. So whether this is completely accurate or not, we see in Roman times there was an understanding of Socrates as having revolutionized the conception of what philosophy is, such that it was taken to be straightforward that if you wanted to be a philosopher, your conception of philosophy had to, in this respect, have a Socratic aspect, as I put it. A life utterly devoid of any Socratic aspect for Cicero would have been a life in which philosophia itself finds no expression. The claim that an ancient philosopher's life in no way resembles that of Socrates would have been unintelligible to him. Conversely, the claim that some ancient philosophers, say Diogenes or Epicurus, Seneca or Cicero, sought to practice a conception of philosophy which bore certain resemblances to that of Socrates would have simply been a tautology. This takes me to the last part of my lecture, the part that is about the title of the lecture, finally. Socratic aspects of Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy. So, what have I shown? I've shown that perhaps philosophy was once, a very long time ago, about living a certain sort of life. Perhaps back then, there was no such thing as separating an understanding of the life, which a particular philosophy enjoins one to live, from an understanding of the philosophy itself. But surely, today, the relation between one's life and one's philosophy is no longer, at least simply for us, what it was for the ancients. We contemporary philosophers, at least many of the colleagues I've had at Harvard and Pittsburgh and Chicago, no longer just look to the sage for an accurate or standard measure of anything except maybe what sells well in the section of the bookstore called metaphysical literature. Or, a certain kind of person who might be interviewed on CNN. Nowadays, we look first and foremost, at least these colleagues of mine, look first and foremost to the well-reasoned philosophical theory for guidance about such matters. And one does not need to be a sage to put forward exemplary instances of such theory. One just needs to be, as my colleagues will say, a well-trained philosopher. Go to graduate school, and you're trained. This is true, at least for much of the philosophy written in the past century. But I think it's not true of what philosophy was for Wittgenstein. In a manner strikingly reminiscent of those ancient accounts of philosophers' thought, this is partly what the exam was meant to bring out, many accounts purporting to supply an overview of Wittgenstein's philosophy do so in a way that is reminiscent of accounts of Socrates. That is, they take the trouble to adduce a wealth of anecdotes and biographical details, often with related points to those that would have been apt for a depiction of Socrates' philosophical conception. And some of those quotations actually figured on your preliminary exam. It could have been longer. So Wittgenstein, like Socrates or Pythagoras, seems to many of his expositors to call for that sort of treatment if we want to get the breadth of what we are trying to describe in describing the thing we call his philosophy. And that's surely not just because Wittgenstein lived in a manner which caused anecdotes about him to proliferate. He was so eccentric and wacky. But because the authors of such accounts take these anecdotes and biographical details to illuminate something about him as a philosopher. Yeah, he was an odd fellow, it's true. And he lived in a very unconventional way. Other stories would bring that out even more. And yes, of course, that provides colorful material for the occasional entertaining digression. But the authors of the accounts I have in mind of his philosophy do not take themselves to be digressing for purposes of entertainment when adducing the material in question. They tend to see an intimate, if elusive, connection between the extraordinariness of that life and the difficulty of that thought and understanding what it aims at, what makes it philosophy understood in that way, his way. And it's doubtful that most of these commentators would imagine that they were able to see this sort of connection. They do not take themselves to also be encouraged to look for that sort of connection by things in Wittgenstein's philosophical writings themselves. By what? Okay, next part of the handout. You have 5 quotations. Now, if many of them refer to writings. If I switch this to writings or sayings, and then I gave it to you as a part of your exam, I think it might be hard to say whether this was Socrates or Wittgenstein speaking. But I'll tell you right now, these are 5 quotations. They're all from Wittgenstein. 1, you cannot write anything about yourself that is more truthful than you yourself are. 2, nothing is so difficult as not deceiving oneself. 3, if anyone is unwilling to descend into himself, he will remain superficial in his writing. 4, working in philosophy is really more a working on oneself. Bless you, you good person, as well as you very good mind reader. 5, that man will be revolutionary who can revolutionize himself. Dieser Mensch is the German. I'm going to change the translation. That person, that human being, will be revolutionary who can revolutionize him or herself. No need for unnecessary sexism here. Okay. So, these are 5 remarks. I'll conclude by just meditating on these 5 remarks for a minute. What sort of remarks are these? What are they about? What is their category? To what genre do they belong? Now, I hope you'll take my word for this. Remarks similar to these in character are found scattered throughout Wittgenstein's writing. I could make this list much longer than 5. But one of the striking things is that when you come across one of these remarks, at least if you have a kind of conception of what an analytic philosopher should be doing, Wittgenstein's often classified as an analytic philosopher, they can seem quite surprising. He's in the middle of thinking about what does it mean for only one person to follow a rule? Or could a language be private? Or can I give something a meaning and convey it by just pointing at something and uttering a word? And then one of these remarks comes. And when you come across one of these remarks, an extended Wittgensteinian, as he calls it, philosophical investigation, it might strike you as quite literally a non sequitur. And indeed, all of these 5 remarks and a whole lot of others were gathered by that same Finnish philosopher, Georg von Richt, in a book, which is then rather strangely called in English Culture and Value. It's just called Mixed Remarks, Vermischte Bemerkungen in German. And his pretext for collecting these was that these are sort of extra philosophical remarks that he thought were interesting about spiritual and cultural matters. So he thought he'd put them in one place. I think that is a deep misunderstanding, actually, of the idea that these remarks belong with each other and not where they found. But someone seems to be objecting on high. So I withdraw that last remark. I apologize to Georg von Richt. He was a very fine man, no longer with us. Let us just ignore my last digression and just ask this question. Why do such remarks crop up in the midst of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations? Apparently, at least to that guy, apparently changing the topic and interrupting the scene of investigation. What you have next in your handout are some quotations by a Wittgenstein commentator and follower named D.Z. Phillips, or D.Z. Phillips, as he called himself. And he argues that Wittgenstein, in each of these passages, should be, in each of these 5, he actually has these 5 in mind, that's why I quoted these 5, but I could have taken others. He should be understood as here referring to difficulties in doing philosophy. This is the first of these in your handout. Difficulties in giving us the problem, giving the problems, the kind of attention that philosophy asks of us. I think if Phillips were speaking, he'd emphasize the word philosophy there, unquote. And I actually agree with that, except for a worry about what's going on when Phillips emphasizes the word philosophy. But first bringing out my point of agreement, we could put it this way. When such a remark occurs in the midst of one of Wittgenstein's investigations, it does not introduce an abrupt change of topic. We're not switching to the personal or the cultural. It interrupts the investigation in order to step back for a moment and comment on a difficulty in philosophy one runs up against in such investigations at this point. Thus, one will not understand what such remarks are about unless one understands why they occur in the sorts of contexts in Wittgenstein's writing in which they characteristically do. They should not be collected together in a separate book. And some people only read that book, the interesting stuff. Phillips goes on in the next passage in your handout to remark that the sort of difficulties that are at issue in these passages from Wittgenstein will be, quote, missed if one equates the difficulty with personal difficulties. This is what Phillips once says. There's nothing personal about this. It's just technical philosophy, or non-technical philosophy. It's philosophy. It's not personal. Now, that's surely right if by personal difficulties what one means is merely personal, as opposed to philosophical difficulties. But it's equally wrong if by this one means, and this is what Phillips meant, philosophical and therefore in no way personal difficulties. Erecting an opposition here between the mutually exclusive categories of the personal and the philosophical will block the way to understanding why Wittgenstein thinks that work in philosophy, properly conducted, is a working on oneself. and why he thinks that one cannot be any more honest in your philosophical speech or writing than you can be with yourself, and why he thinks that the greatness of philosophical work is expressive of the greatness of the particular human being that is the author of the remark. Phillips is certainly right that the wrong sort of insistence on the idea that these difficulties are personal can lead to a disastrous misinterpretation of Wittgenstein's work. That's what he's worried about. I'm insisting that the opposite emphasis can too. Too sharp a recoil from that first interpretation, with a complementary insistence upon too sharp a separation between the category of your life as you live it and what a philosophical problem is equally obstructive of an understanding of Wittgenstein's conception of what is difficult about philosophy. So looking back over those 5 remarks, take the one, nothing is so difficult as not deceiving oneself. I would say that is neither more nor less a remark about a peculiar difficulty which arises in philosophy than it's a remark about a general ethical difficulty. For Wittgenstein thought that one's ability to avoid self-deception in philosophy can be neither more nor less than one's ability to avoid it outside philosophy. If you're unwilling to descend into yourself, then you remain superficial in your writing and speaking and thinking. And a fortiori, you remain superficial in your efforts to write or speak philosophy. So I think each of these 5 remarks is at once personal and philosophical. When Wittgenstein says, if one is unwilling to descend into oneself, he remains superficial, he's equally committed to the converse of that remark. If someone remains superficial in his thinking and writing, this can, where it's not a function of mere immaturity or ineptitude, be a genuine reflection of the character. The philosophy is a reflection of the character of the person whose thinking and writing it is. And for Wittgenstein, it's not only possible to discern aspects of someone's character and the character of their philosophizing, but he thinks it's actually essential to any true estimate of their philosophy that one be able to do so. Wittgenstein's often criticized for making ad hominem objections to philosophers. I think that misses his understanding of the relationship between life and thought. The exercise of the form of discernment I was just talking about is never far below the surface of the judgments that Wittgenstein makes of other philosophers. So I'll end with some examples. Wittgenstein's notebooks and recorded conversations give you lots of ways in which Wittgenstein exercises this discernment. About Frank Ramsey, he says, quote, Ramsey's incapacity for genuine enthusiasm, or what is really the same thing, his incapacity for reverence, came to disgust me more and more, unquote. He's commenting on something about Ramsey's sensibility that reflects itself in, but not only in, the character of Ramsey's response to a philosophical problem or idea. What is at issue here is a kind of limitation of sensibility that's neither merely personal nor merely philosophical, but rather equally, and in Wittgenstein's eyes, equally faithfully, both. Maurice Drury said to Wittgenstein once, I enjoy reading William James. He's such a human person. And Wittgenstein responded, yes. And that's what makes him a good philosopher. He was a real human being, unquote. This is someone Wittgenstein disagreed with a great deal about this. That William James is a real human being is something Wittgenstein takes himself to be able to discern as a reader of James's writings. He never met him. And this estimate he forms in this regard of James as a person is not, and for Wittgenstein cannot be utterly independent of his estimate of him qua philosopher. Another example, he remarks about the famous British philosopher, his contemporary A.J. Ayer, quote, he has something to say, but it's incredibly shallow. This is in the first instance, of course, a remark about the shallowness of Ayer's philosophizing. But it's not merely a remark about the quality of those efforts, and is such wholly without bearing on an estimate of the shallowness or the depth of the sensibility of the person whose philosophizing it is. Finally, about the anthropologist James Fraser, he says, Fraser is more savage than most of his savages. He wrote about various primitive peoples. This is a comment on both the man and the thought. It's a comment on something that shows itself, Wittgenstein thought, in Fraser's writing about various forms of life he purported to study, where part of what shows itself is something about what, for Fraser himself, were the possibilities of life and thought that were open to him, what the possibilities of his imagining, what another life that wasn't his could be like. I think Wittgenstein's biographer, Remark, puts it well when he says, "Nothing is hidden is for Wittgenstein an ethical as well as a logical remark." When Wittgenstein writes his sister and says to her, quote, "Call me a truth seeker, and I will be satisfied," unquote, he there specifies the character of his striving in terms of something which is equally a logical and an ethical ideal. All philosophical thinking and writing accordingly has for Wittgenstein what we might call an ethical aspect. He thought that what, and more importantly, how we think is revelatory of who we are, and that learning to think better, and above all, to really profoundly to be able to change how you think, is the most important means to becoming better, to be becoming what Wittgenstein calls a real human being. So even though Wittgenstein in one sense is sometimes said to have no ethics, if ethics names a separate branch of philosophy, which you do instead of other branches, and which has its own proprietary subject matter, in another sense, his thinking and writing on every page of his works takes place under the pressure of what we might call an ethical demand. If one turns to examine this life, and if one has the eyes to see, which will require some understanding of his philosophy, not just looking at stories about his life, then one will discover, I think, the pressure of that demand equally pervasively manifest in the conduct of how he lives and his understanding of the relation between his philosophy and his life. Thank you.